Catch up on BBC iPlayer.
This is BBC One in the Northwest. Now the BBC News with Michelle Hussain, Gordon Burns and Ranveer Singh at 6 o'clock.
The police hit back at criticism of their response to the riots, insisting that the tactics that worked were theirs. Both politicians and the police are under pressure as questions are asked almost 1 week on from the start of the violence.
Clearly, we needed to act this week to get control of the streets, to get them back for the law-abiding. The police did that. They did change their tactics. They did increase police numbers. That was the right thing to do.
Let's be very clear on one thing. The vital distinction between policing and politics remains. And the police service will make the tactical decisions, and quite rightly and robustly, we should and must be held to account.
After more arrests over the looting, public appeals for information that could bring the perpetrators to justice.
They've all been brought up to think there's no worse crime than grassing. Doesn't matter what you do not grass.
A man's arrested for murder after a pensioner badly injured in the London riots dies in hospital. Also coming up tonight, another turbulent week for the financial markets, but shares in London end on a positive note. In Syria, troops open fire on protesters as international condemnation grows. And in cricket, Alistair Cook smashes a double century as England dominate India in the third test.
And in the Northwest, we talk to the Prime Minister as he visits the region after the riots, and we challenge him on the Police Federation warning they may not be able to cope again if numbers are cut.
Good evening. Welcome to the BBC News at 6. Police officers have hit back at suggestions that it was the intervention of politicians that proved decisive in their handling of the riots. After criticism of their tactics from the Prime Minister, senior officers today said that they had faced a unique situation and that they alone had been responsible for the shift to more robust policing. For the first of tonight's reports, our home editor Mark Easton looks now at the political and the police response to the riots.
A week after the riots began, senior police officers and government politicians have indulged in a public row as each seeks to avoid any blame for the lawlessness. Emerging from the latest meeting of the Emergency Planning Committee COBRA, the acting head of Scotland Yard made a clearly barbed remark at criticism of the police operation by ministers who were still on holiday at the time.
I think after any event like this, there are always people that will make comment that weren't there, and
It's clear that many senior officers are furious at suggestions that police only got their act together when politicians banged the table.
Let's be very clear on one thing. The vital distinction between policing and politics remains, and the police service will make the tactical decisions, and quite rightly and robustly we should and must be held to account. If we're not, the system fails.
Yesterday, government ministers accused police of putting too few officers on the street, being too slow to respond and too timid in dealing with the looters. Today, the Home Secretary had nothing but praise for the police response.
What I accept was that the people who got the riots under control were the police, the brave policemen and women who were out there on the front line dealing with the riots as they were happening.
The troubling sight of law and order in retreats this week means that for politicians and police alike, the stakes in this affair remain very high.
The politics of the riots is shifting from condemnation and measures to restore public order and confidence to broader questions about our culture, our society and our values.
The leaders of the three main political parties in England were all talking about learning the lessons of the riots today. In the early hours of Monday, police in Brixton were pursuing looters. Today, Labour's leader found himself pursued by his own angry supporters.
All those things. These people have nothing to lose. They've got no stake in society and they've got no social mobility at all. And that we need the Labour Party. We desperately.
The criticism is that politicians have been too quick to condemn and too slow to try to understand.
Okay, Adele, nice to meet you. Cheers, take care.
Are there not social reasons for this?
Of course there are.
Don't you keep discussing those rather than just talking about criminality all the time?
Well, no, but we're not just talking about criminality. I think look, the first priority was to restore public order and to make clear that we were never going to excuse what happened. but excusing is not the same as explaining. And now we're into the phase where we've got to try and explain what happened.
On Tuesday, a police station in Nottingham was firebombed. Today, the Lib Dem leader paid a visit and suggested the event posed important questions for all of us.
We have to ask ourselves why an 11-year-old girl, or young teenagers, feel that they've got so little stake in their own neighbourhood, in their own community, that they've got so little sense of kind of belonging that they go around trashing it.
Central Manchester was the scene of widespread looting on Tuesday night. Today, the Prime Minister was in the city to meet emergency services before appearing on the BBC. David Cameron was asked whether there wasn't a difference between the attitude towards greedy looters and greedy bankers or greedy MPs.
People who cheat in banking and who break an account, they should be punished. MPs who cheat on their expenses should be punished. And there are MPs in prison today, and quite rightly so too.
The example isn't being set from the top.
Look, we need responsibility right through our country. Responsibility is the most important word in politics, but it can't be used as an excuse.
The huge extra police presence will remain this weekend. No one dare suggest this crisis can be described as over. In many ways, the questions are just beginning. Mark Easton, BBC News.
Let's go live now to our political correspondent Ian Watson, who's in Downing Street. Ian, after all this talk about a rift between the politicians and the police, what about divides within the politicians?
Well, let's start, Michelle, with at one point of agreement at least between the politicians, as we heard from Mark Easton. Both Ed Miliband, the Labour leader, and the Prime Minister agreed that a lack of responsibility in some sections of society could be to blame for the kind of scenes we've seen on the streets recently. The difficulty comes when you start to look at potential solutions to all this. Now, we've had some very tough talking from Number 10 this week, because the officials behind that door will tell you it was so important that the Prime Minister was seen to be getting a grip on all this this week. Now, the Prime Minister, of course, has been floating some ideas which are proving quite controversial. For example, withdrawing benefits from some of the rioters, or temporarily shutting down social networks such as Twitter. Labour have been warning against knee-jerk solutions. But more significantly, I think, inside the coalition, senior Liberal Democrats are telling me it's very unlikely that some of that tough rhetoric will become reality when the current tensions subside.
Ian, thank you. Ian Watson in Downing Street. Well, the Prime Minister said tonight that he's heartened with how quickly those charged with the riots are being processed by the criminal justice system. With the number of arrests now above 1,600, magistrates in London again worked through the night to deal with cases. In Manchester, one of those appearing in court was an 18-year-old charged with setting fire to a branch of Miss Selfridge. Our UK Affairs correspondent Chris Buckler has this assessment of how the offenders are being handled.
Following the havoc of the last week, the courts have begun revealing just who was responsible, including 2 young footballers. Some people have been remanded in custody, including a teenager who denies starting this fire that destroyed a store. Others have been jailed, including a man who left the disorder in Salford because he heard the riots in Manchester were better. But in an estate just minutes from where some of this week's violence took place, there are people prepared to admit that they could have got caught up in all of the looting.
I went through Salford after that had happened. If I'd have seen something on the floor, I'd have took it home.
But is that not wrong?
Yeah, of course it is, but like, that's what I mean, like, I don't know, like, I think I'm quite, if I had a phone, I had loads of pictures in, I'd want to give it back, but if I picked up something that was mass produced and you could get millions of them from a factory and it was just there on the floor, I'd take it home, of course I would.
After the damage done in cities across this country, the government has promised swift justice. This 13-year-old boy went to the riots with a hammer strapped to his leg. He can't be identified because of his age, and the judge said he only escaped prison because of his youth. And in Manchester city centre, the faces of other people suspected of causing the chaos. The police asking for people to shop those who destroyed its stores.
In the last 24 hours, 2 mothers have handed in a 15-year-old and a 13-year-old boy, their sons. They've handed them into the police because they saw their pictures in the newspaper.
In Salford, most shops are now open again, but the destruction was the last thing it needed. Jobs are hard to come by, youth unemployment is high, and child poverty and crime are both genuine problems.
People peppered, aren't they? People got no money, man. So people are going to do things like that. It's opportunist, isn't it?
Many here are anything but sympathetic, but there is a fear of being seen to talk to the police.
They've all been brought up to think there's no worse crime than grassing. It doesn't matter what you do not grass.
But do you not think it's important that people do go forward and give information?
Of course I do. Excuse me, I went to court, didn't I? And I suffered for a long time because of it. I couldn't walk past anyone in the street without being hissed at and spat at.
The public mood is clear. There is a desire to see people punished. Today, the prison population in England and Wales hit an all-time high. But Leroy Grant, who spent 10 years in jail for armed robbery, questions whether that will help prevent further crime.
They've given out sentences of like 4 months and 6 months, yeah? It's absolutely farcical, because what's going to happen now in like 4 weeks' time, those people are going to be out on tag anyway. There's no point sending them to prison. The trouble with this country, yeah, is
but you were in prison at one stage.
I've been to some tough jails.
And did that not deter you?
If anything, it made me worse.
However, if the police appeals are successful, those who have already appeared in court will be joined by many others in being named and shamed. Chris Buckler, BBC News, Manchester.
A 22-year-old man has been arrested on suspicion of murder after the death of a 68-year-old man who was badly injured in rioting in West London on Monday night. Richard Mannington Bowes was attacked as he tried to stamp out a fire. Our Home Affairs correspondent June Kelly has the latest on what's becoming known as the Ealing murder.
The heart of a suburban shopping centre is now a place where people are coming to remember a life lost. It was at the start of the week the attack took place in Ealing in West London. Today it became a murder inquiry. Richard Mannington Bowes was 68. He'd lost touch with his family. It was only yesterday that he was finally identified. Mr. Mannington Bowes was said to have been set upon as he remonstrated with rioters who'd set fire to an industrial bin. As he tried to put the fire out, he was attacked.
His leg was lying very close to the fire. I got the young lads to help me move him into this alleyway, so at least his torso and head was protected, because on the left here were the rioting youths, and they were throwing stones down the road towards the police on the right, so it was quite a vulnerable position.
This is the flat where Richard Mannington Bowes lived. It's just a short distance from where he was attacked. He was known as someone who would confront people if they were behaving in an antisocial way. He may have been a quiet man, but he thought that wrongdoers needed to be challenged. In the neighbourhood, nobody knew him well. He was seen as a solitary figure, but he was a familiar face to local business people.
It's just a really awful thing that someone who was obviously just very quiet, sort of gentle kind of guy, obviously was trying to help put out the fires.
He was quietly dignified, and he reminded me of a bygone age when people said please and thank you and were courteous to each other. He always, to me, symbolised that generation, which seems to be lost for the time being.
At Ealing Town Hall, the flag is at half-mast as a mark of respect.
He was a gentleman who went out of his way to look after the neighbourhood, tell people not to drop litter, that kind of thing, and he intervened to stop the looting. He paid a terrible, terrible price.
One man is currently under arrest, and police are appealing to anyone who can help their inquiry to come forward. June Kelly, BBC News, West London.
The police watchdog, the Independent Police Complaints Commission, has admitted tonight that it may have misled journalists into believing that the man who was shot dead by police last Thursday night fired shots at police first. Mark Duggan, who was 29, was shot by officers in Tottenham. His death sparked the initial riots in London. Our correspondent John Brain joins us now from Tottenham. What are they saying there, John?
Well, Michelle, in the immediate aftermath of the shooting, the IPCC came under a lot of criticism for allegedly not giving enough information about the shooting and not giving it quickly enough. It's now admitted that some of the information it did give may have been misleading. Mark Duggan received 2 shots. One hit him in the chest and killed him. The other one passed through his arm and became lodged in a police radio. Now, the IPCC says that because of that second bullet, it wrongly assumed there'd been an exchange of fire, that Mark Duggan had actually used his gun. Well, tonight it's admitted that that was wrong and has apologised for giving a misleading impression. As for Mark Duggan himself, well, tonight here in Tottenham, people are gathering to remember him in a local community centre. Michelle.
John, thank you. John Brain there. And there'll be more on the riots later in the programme. Now, though, the rest of the evening's news.